Hey guys, this is Echo Soundworks, and you are checking out a Serum tip and trick tutorial video on ADSR. In this video, I'm going to show you 5 different tips, tricks, or techniques that will get you better, more cohesive sounding supersaws. So I get this question a lot actually, whether it's through social media or email. A lot of people seem to be struggling with getting supersaw sounds that sound clean and fit well in a mix in Serum. And it is, I would say, the number one reason for that is you're doing too much. So for instance, if we compare the kind of like the quintessential Supersaw, Hypersaw, soft synth, which is probably Silent 1, arguably Silent 1, or Silent, is comparing it to Serum, you have a lot less options, right? With Silent, you load up your saw waveform, choose your voices, your voice count, which can go only up to 8, and then you detune, and then you have a control for stereo width too. That's really it. Outside of choosing maybe a slightly different waveform, maybe like a pulse or a triangle saw, that's really all you can do. Well, with Serum, you can obviously use wavetables. You can obviously have more control over how the wavetables are moving with warp modes, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot more going on, and there's some pitfalls that you can kind of stumble across in that process. So let's dive right in. All right, so the first thing that you want to be aware of when you're trying to get a good sounding supersaw or hypersaw is you want to use a saw waveform. You don't necessarily want to use a really complex wave table. This is where I think a lot of people run into their first issue in Serum when they're trying to get a supersaw sound. Now, one of the biggest benefits to a wavetable synth is obviously being able to move and maybe modulate an LFO or an envelope through the wavetable positions, through the different frames or cycles. Well, with a supersaw, that gets kind of messy, because if you have a really intricate wavetable and you're detuning, so there's a lot of voices and you're spreading out the detuned unison voices out wide, and then you're moving through the wavetable positions where it might change from like a saw to a square to like a triangle to something grittier, it's not going to be a cohesive, clean sound, especially comparatively to Silent, right? So first thing you want to do is load up 1 or 2 oscillators of a saw waveform. Now, I like to work with sometimes a default, just typical saw waveform, or I like to do like a variation of that, maybe like a rounded saw waveform, or maybe something with a little bit of noise introduced. So like this one is technically still, I would still call it a saw. It's going to have a saw type sound. So if I play this right now, right, it sounds like a saw, but it's a little bit different. Let's turn this down, it's pretty loud. There's the default saw, and here's this rounded one. Right, it's just a pinch different, and if we add more voices to it, those differences will start to add up. So that's the first thing you want to do. All right, the second thing you're going to want to do is introduce voices of Unison and then detune and blend those together. Now, Serum goes up to a Unison count of 16. Now that can be quite a lot of voices, especially if you're using 2 oscillators. So if we do a quick history lesson on supersaws, the original supersaw was 7. I believe Access Virus has a version that they call the hypersaw, which is 8. So I usually go anywhere from about 6 to 12. So let's just go to 10 right now. So here is oscillator A with the default saw waveform with 10 voices of Unison, detune at about halfway, and let's turn the blend at about halfway. So the detune, as you can see here visually, is basically going to spread out those detune voices. So the further up you get towards 1, the more you hear, because it's spreading it out away from the center voices. Now the blend here will disproportionately or proportionally, depending how you're looking at, blend the center voices with the actual voices of Unison. So these yellow ones are the ones in the center, and these green ones are the Unison voices. So if we turn the blend all the way up and the detune all the way up, we get a crazy, weird sound. All right, so when you're going to be working with a monophonic sound, maybe it's like a drop to a trap song or main room or whatever, you can tend to boost the Unison and the detune up a little bit higher. But if you're going to be playing chords, maybe like a la future bass, that sort of stuff, you want to keep it a little bit more conservative. All right, so that being said, I'm going to have the settings to about right there. All right, so now that we have that set up on oscillator A, let's go over to oscillator B, and let's do the same thing, but I'm going to give this less voices of Unison. Okay, and this one, the second oscillator source, I like to pitch up or down. And then I'll typically turn that down a little bit. Okay, that helps spread out and create more voices and just a thickness that works, especially for a lead sound. Okay, so there is what you're going to want to do in terms of unison counts, detune, and blend within the oscillators. All right, so the next thing you want to address is the sub and noise oscillators, and if you want those two oscillators active in your sound. I personally definitely almost always use the noise oscillator with the Supersaw sound. I think it can help create a interesting and unique texture in Serum that you can't get with other synths because you can import your own custom noise samples, or you can use a bunch of the already included ones, which are quite unique. Now, in terms of the sub oscillator, you wouldn't want to really stick a sub, maybe like a sine sub with it, but you want to, at certain points in your productions, whether you're using it as a lead, a chord, or whatever, it might be beneficial to use a saw waveform in the sub that then is pitched an octave lower than the rest of it. So for instance, it would sound like this right now. Right, that sounds bad right there. But if we turn the level down a little bit, and if we change this to mono and turn up the glide, it still is pretty noticeable, but that will be reduced once we start to filter things and start to EQ. But if you're using a Supersaw as a drop sound, maybe it's a trap song, maybe it's any genre that you have, main room, any genre that you're using a Supersaw sound as a drop, you're just going to have bass and kick typically there. So it might fill out the mix more to have something there. Now, it also, the sub cannot be detuned, right? It doesn't have the unison and detune. So it gives your sound something in the middle. So it's not just out left and right because of the blend of the detune and unison voices, which is kind of nice. So let's keep that there for now. And let's turn on the noise. Let's go to a weird one here. Let's do like an air can from the Organics. All right, so let me play a chord with this. It'll sound quite nice with the low octave too from the sub. So let me turn down the noise, and let's turn down the glide a little. All right, so this is the point in which when you're making a Supersaw sound, before it has effects, before it has filtering, before you've messed with envelopes, LFO, modulation, that sort of stuff. If it doesn't sound good and clean here and kind of what you're ultimately going for, you probably messed up in the first two steps and you need to readdress it. It still should sound like a cool Supersaw style sound right now. All right, so let's move on to the next tip. All right, so we're now on to the fourth tip. Now this fourth one is actually be happening in the effects slot. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to load an effect chain because you can save these in Serum, which is really cool. So let's just do let's do a chord patch here, and let's turn on the delay. Let's set the EQ first, the compression second, and let's have the reverb happening last. Okay, so that all looks right. I'll change this to a ping pong delay. So now we have some effects, so the sound will be coming to life a little bit more. So let's check this out. Okay, now we have the multiband compression on. Let's take that off so there's less differentiation in the frequencies that we heard in the last clip. All right, so I've taken out some of the low frequencies here with this EQ. Again, we can roll that back, and I boosted some of the highs. Okay, so let's turn the air can noise down a little bit. All right, so now we have some delay, some reverb is sounding kind of cool. There's this little hyper dimension section on the effects rack that can do some really cool things. You have the dimension expander, which is cool in its own right. If you're a massive user, you'll know and understand what that is. There's also this hyper, which will just detune sounds, which is really cool. So if we crank this up, right, it's adding detune to our effects, to the whole sound of Serum. Now, in that regard, in the last video, I said that you can't really detune the sub. Well, now you can. For instance, if we turn off oscillators A and B and the noise, and we keep this hyper on, and I'll turn off all the other effects right now. That's coming from just the saw waveform in our noise or in our sub oscillator. So you can actually detune that. Right, and you can re-trigger it. So this will also affect the noise as well. So let's turn off the sub so you can hear this. Right, it's making the noise basically wider and almost like it's creating like this detune unison. So this is another great tip and trick. Now I don't know if we necessarily need it for this exact sound that I'm making, but we'll have it on and I'll just turn it on lightly. So we'll go to 5 voices of unison. And let's turn on the subs, the oscillator A and the oscillator B. So we turn down the whole sound now. So this is what we have. And you can also use the sub as not a sub or lower frequency oscillator. You can just use it as a third oscillator to create another saw sound that then is being detuned, or it's a little bit more center specific because it's not detuned as much because of the hyper dimension. All right, let's go on to the next tip and trick. All right, guys, so the 5th tip and trick here is to use your warp modes on the oscillators. Now, the warp modes basically will move in between or kind of change what's happening with the frame that you're on in your wavetable. This is another reason why using a wavetable that has a lot of information, maybe it changes from like a saw to a square to a sine to some other waveform, can be a little bit tricky to make it sound clean and cohesive when you're making a supersaw sound. So I have an LFO shape here I just quickly drew in. You can use any LFO shape you want, doesn't matter. We're gonna load up bend plus and minus because it's a good one to start with. So if I have it in the middle on the warp mode control here for bend plus or minus, it's like the warp mode's not even on. Now if I turn it to the left, it kind of pinches the wave and it'll be more nasally sounding. So let's turn off oscillators B and the sub and noise. Turn down the... Right, so that is what we got. And then if we turn the bend up to the minus side, it almost sounds like a square sound, right? All right, before we get into that, though, I do want to point out that I did add a filter and I did add an envelope that's adding like a quick tick to the sound by modulating into the coarse pitch of oscillator A. So let's bring back oscillators B, sub, and noise. Now, let's turn the bend plus or minus back to its default positions about halfway, and let's modulate a little bit. And I'm going to hold down Option Shift on my keyboard so it's going plus and minus with this. And I have the LFO set to, I might have called it an envelope there a second ago, I meant LFO. But I want it set to envelope. Right, and we're gonna do the same thing here on oscillator B, but let's use a different shape. Let's just do bend minus, okay? And again, I just want a little bit of movement because it's gonna help make the sound a little bit more three-dimensional and cool. So let's play this real quick. Right, now if we take the envelope up on the attack on the envelope 1, be more of like a future bass type chord sound we can do. But right now we have a nice, clean, large sounding supersaw. And we're just doing very basic things. So there you guys go. There is the 5 tips and tricks. I lied. Here is a bonus tip and trick. 5 sounded better for the title, but I did want to show you this one because it's actually a really cool one. So go to your global page once you have your sound pretty much made. Now, there's this whole section right here called Unison, and you can change a lot of the sound of your supersaw sound by messing with these controls. For instance, the width here, this will basically allow you to have higher unison voice counts, but while still having a cohesive sound for chord sounds. So if we were to turn these two down to like 50, the sound is not going to be as wide, and it may actually be a little bit better for phase correlation. So let's bring up a phase analyzer here. So here it is at 100 and 100. Basically at pretty much stereo. We're in the middle of the phase correlation here. Let's turn it down to 50 and 50, or around there on both of them. Right, we have better correlation. We still have the big sound. So if you're having trouble getting it to fit in the mix, mess with the width control. Sometimes I very rarely have it up at actually 100. Now next you have this warp function, and as the hot tip says here, it adjusts the warp offset of the different Unison voices. So if you're using a strong warp function, we're not using a strong one, we're using a subtle one, you can exaggerate the effect or reduce it a little bit. So with ours, let's turn it up on oscillator A. Let's actually turn it way up on oscillator B, and let's keep it pretty much at 0 for oscillator A. Right, so we got a really nice, big, clean sound still. Now, next you have, down here, we have different stack modes, and this actually, we have a stack feature and then a different mode, rather. One of my favorite modes is Super. I just like how it sounds. So let's play this again. It's a nice sound, and you can mess with these different algorithms for different types of sound. But my favorite is Super. Now, next you get the, let's go to the stacks. These will basically stack different voices. Maybe it's an octave higher than the octave you're currently set at. Maybe it's below, or sometimes it's even chords, and you can just kind of tab through these. So here is, you can hear it's kind of really high pitched now. Here's a 7th, plus 7, so we got a 5th in there. Center -12. This is a really cool one for big chord sounds. Right? It just sounds really big now. This one's even center, then it goes down to center -24. So I like using, it's a lead, sometimes these 12 with the 1 times in it, which means it's gonna be higher. So now we have both of those active on both of the oscillators. So this should be a huge Supersaw sound. Now let's play it real quick. All right, there you guys go. If you have any questions or comments, let me know below. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I am Echo Soundworks. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.